Biochemist Dr. Fuz Rana is Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe, an organization dedicated to demonstrating the compatibility of science and Christianity. His studies of cellular systems convinced him of a creator's existence and set him on a journey to faith in Christ. Today, Fuz is the author of multiple books, including Creating Life in the Lab, and speaks on the evidence for creation from biochemistry, genetics, and human origins. Please welcome Fuz Rana.
Good morning. Well, good morning, everybody. I've got a question for you to get things started. When you get to heaven, who's the first person that you want to meet? Now, of course, when we get to heaven, we want to see Jesus, and we want to see our loved ones, our friends, and our family members. But think about this for a minute. Throughout the history of the church, there's been some amazing people that have served the Lord Jesus Christ. And when we get to heaven, we have access to all those people. And so my question to you is, who's the first person that you're going to want to spend some time with? In fact, just for fun, turn to the person next to you and tell them who you would like to meet when you get to heaven. Okay. I wonder if a couple of you would just like to shout out who you'd like to meet. Maybe somebody over here. Just shout out. Paul. Man, good choice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Yeah, that's a great choice. Well, the person I want to meet when I get to heaven is Blind Willie Johnson. How many of you know who Blind Willie Johnson is? A few of you. I like you already. The reason I want to meet Blind Willie Johnson is because I love the blues, and he's among my favorite blues musicians. But there's another reason I want to meet Blind Willie Johnson, because his life and his ministry serves as an inspiration and an example for me in my work at Reasons to Believe. Blind Willie Johnson's life reminds me that the greatest challenges oftentimes turn into the greatest opportunities for the gospel. And that's the point that I want to communicate to you this morning. Now, I know everybody in here has challenges in life, but have you ever thought that those challenges could be opportunities for ministry, that those challenges could be opportunities for you to share your faith? And I see a few of you nodding your heads. That tells me that you've already come to that realization. But this is a very important lesson when it comes to using science as a way to build a bridge to the gospel. There is some incredible scientific evidences that demonstrate God's existence and the reliability of Scripture, as Jim gave us a few examples, and Hugh will give us some more examples later on this morning. And when you use scientific evidence, again, to build a case for the Christian faith, it's important also to recognize that there are ideas in science, there are discoveries from science that sometimes can challenge Christianity, can in fact challenge the very core of the Christian faith. And it's important to remember in the midst of those challenges that those challenges can turn into opportunities to demonstrate the credibility of Christianity. And I've seen that happen in my lifetime working in ministry, where again, I've been using science as a way to defend the Christian faith. Now, one area where there is some really significant challenges to the Christian faith is this idea of human evolution. This is an idea that basically says human beings are the product of an unguided, undirected, historically contingent evolutionary process. That we're just one among countless number of species that have existed on the earth, that there's nothing special about human beings. And try as I might, I cannot reconcile this idea of human evolution with the idea that we learn from the biblical text about human origins, namely that we were made through God's direct personal intervention in His image, and that there was a primordial pair, an Adam and an Eve, from which all people descend. I cannot square the idea of human evolution with what the biblical text teaches. And this, of course, is significant because the biblical account of human origins is foundational to a number of key doctrines that are part of Christianity. In fact, you could argue that the gospel itself rests on the biblical understanding of human origins. 25 years ago, when I first became interested in using science for evangelism, there was absolutely nothing we could say substantial to build a positive case for the biblical understanding of human origins from science. In fact, the best we could do is take a few pot shots at Darwin's theory, but we really couldn't do much more than that. It represented a significant challenge to the Christian faith. But in the last 25 years, I've seen some remarkable advances that have turned those challenges into opportunities to show the scientific credibility of the biblical view of human origins. And I'm going to tell you about 3 of those advances this morning. The first has to do with scientific discoveries that show us that it's credible scientifically to think that there was an Adam and Eve from which all humanity emanates. I'm going to talk to you about discoveries that demonstrate that human beings are uniquely made in God's image. And I'm going to talk about discoveries that demonstrate that our genetic blueprint, our genetic makeup actually bears evidence for design and is befitting the handiwork of a creator. Now, before we get into that this morning, I want to tell you a little bit more about Blind Willie Johnson so you can understand why I find his life so inspirational. Blind Willie Johnson was born around the turn of the last century, around 1900, and he grew up and he lived most of his life in a small town called Marlin, Texas. The story goes that when Blind Willie Johnson was 5 years old, he announced to his family that he wanted to become a preacher. 2 years later, Blind Willie Johnson lost his eyesight when his stepmother, in a fit of rage, threw a hot solution of caustic lye at his face. And it got into his eyes, and he lost his eyesight. Blind Willie Johnson learned to play the guitar and became, or fell under the influence of a man by the name of Madkin Butler, who was a songster. A songster was someone in those days who stood on the street corner and played gospel music and preached the gospel. Madkin Butler taught Blind Willie Johnson how to play the guitar, how to sing, and the two of them stood on the street corners of Marlin, Texas, and they preached the gospel through song. Blind Willie Johnson turned a challenge into an opportunity for the gospel. And this is very much the case when it comes to, got ahead of myself, when it comes to the question of Adam and Eve's historicity. 25 years ago, the prevailing view of human origins was something called multi-regionalism. This was an idea from an evolutionary perspective that basically said humanity began about 2 million years ago when a primitive form of human emerged in Africa. And this is an attempt to kind of illustrate that concept. And that this primitive human migrated out of Africa into Asia, Australia, and into Europe. And in different parts of the world, these primitive humans evolved to a modern form where there was gene flow happening between the populations, remaining or sustaining the integrity as a single species. But because these creatures evolved to a modern form of human in different parts of the world, racial differences emerged as a consequence of that. 25 years ago, anthropologists would claim that the fossil record provided powerful support for this idea. Yet what I've seen in the last 25 years is some remarkable advances in an area known as molecular anthropology. Now, have any of you heard of the company 23andMe, right? Where you can submit a DNA sample to them and they'll do genetic testing on you and tell you a little bit about your ancestry. Have any of you done that just out of curiosity? Nobody. A few people. Are some of you afraid to do that because you're not sure what will be discovered? Well, it's that same technology that anthropologists are using to basically characterize human origins. And what has been discovered is phenomenal. That humanity has an origin in a single location, according to molecular anthropology, not multiple locations around the world. And that location, by the way, is very close to where we think the Garden of Eden would have been. Humanity's origin is thousands of years ago, not a couple of million years ago, and using the genetic marker mitochondrial DNA, every person on the planet can trace an origin back to a single ancestral sequence that many people think corresponds to a single female individual. And every man using Y chromosomal DNA as a genetic marker can trace an origin back to a single ancestral sequence that many people think, again, corresponds to a single male individual, and these are referred to as mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. It's almost as if scientists have discovered the biblical Adam and the biblical Eve, or at least it makes you wonder, right? Now, in addition to that, you can use these genetic markers to trace the spread of humanity around the world. And that pattern of spread comports in a remarkable way with what you'd expect to see based on the account in Genesis 10 of humanity's migration or spread around the world. So here from molecular anthropology, we have scientific evidence for human origin and for humanity's origin and spread that is consistent with the biblical understanding of human origins. In a sense, this is also a metaphor for Blind Willie Johnson's ministry. It began on the street corners of the small town of Marlin, Texas, but it expanded throughout the United States in the 1930s. And it all happened because Blind Willie Johnson met a man by the name of Frank Walker. Frank Walker worked for Columbia Records, and he was traveling throughout the South recording in makeshift studios he would set up in hotel rooms black artists, with the idea that these recordings that they were producing could be sold to black consumers. These were called the race recordings. And it turns out that in the span of 3 years, Blind Willie Johnson recorded 30 sides for Columbia Records. All of them were gospel blues songs. And his recordings are, in fact, among the most popular recordings of the race recordings. So Blind Willie Johnson's ministry went from the street corners of Marlin, Texas, and it spread throughout the United States because he was willing to let a challenge become an opportunity for the gospel. Let's move to the next area, and this has to do with the idea that human beings are made in God's image. The theory of human evolution represents a direct assault on this idea. The idea, from an evolutionary perspective, is there's nothing special about human beings. We're glorified apes. That those things that we think make us special have their antecedents in the behaviors of the great apes. And that these capacities that we possess are only just a little bit more of the same that emerge gradually, degree by degree by degree. Darwin writes these words in The Descent of Man. In a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. In other words, we differ only in degree, not kind, from any other creature, according to human evolution. Now, as a Christian, I'm deeply troubled by this idea, but I must tell you, as a parent, I think Darwin was onto something. Because when my kids were little, I wasn't sure where ape ended and human being began sometimes. But in all seriousness, this idea in the last few years is rapidly eroding and is being replaced by a concept called human exceptionalism, where primatologists and anthropologists are arguing that human beings truly are different in kind, not just different in degree from other creatures, that we are exceptional. And one of the scientists who holds this view is a scientist by the name of Thomas Suddendorf, who in the book called The Gap makes this very argument. And I just want to read you something from The Gap. This quote is so powerful, we've included it in our book, Who is Adam, that I co-authored with Hugh Ross. But basically what Suddendorf is saying here is this: we reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history, our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forest. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds. In whose image are we made? Now, the difference between humans and other creatures, according to anthropologists, is a quality called symbolism. Human beings are the only creature that has symbolic capability. And what symbolism essentially refers to is our capacity to represent the world in discrete symbols, where we can manipulate those symbols in an infinite number of ways, producing alternate possibilities. And so language, both written and spoken language, is a form of symbolism. Art is a form of symbolism. Music is a form of symbolism. And even jewelry use, body ornamentation, is a form of symbolism. And only human beings display that quality. I think of symbolism as being essentially a manifestation of the image of God. And so here we have anthropologists saying that humans are exceptional in a quality that is easy to connect to the idea of the image of God, that there's scientific evidence that we truly are unique. Now, evolutionary biologists would argue that this symbolism emerged in a gradual manner, and that we should see evidence for proto-symbolism or early symbolism among Homo erectus and Neanderthals. Now, have any of you heard claims that Neanderthals made music, that Neanderthals made art? Right? You've heard those claims? Well, the fact of the matter is when you begin to examine those claims critically, they don't hold up to scientific scrutiny. In fact, Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz, in an article recently, said this: among Neanderthals, all claimed instances of early symbolism are strongly disputed, and for Homo erectus, there are no specific claims of this kind at all. Again, we have scientific evidence now that allows us to make a credible case that human beings truly are unique in a way that aligns with the image of God. Let's move to the third area, the design of the human genetic blueprint, or the human genome. The genome refers to the entire genetic makeup of a human being. 25 years ago, the prevailing view was that the human genome and the genomes of other organisms was littered with evolutionary garbage, with these junk DNA sequences that were non-functional, that were the vestiges or the leftovers of an evolutionary history. And when the human genome sequence was published in 2000, the conclusion was 95% of the human genome consists of junk. It's very difficult to square that idea with the notion that we're the product of a creator's handiwork. Why would God create creatures who are the crown of his creation with genomes, with a genetic blueprint which defines who we are, at least biologically speaking? Why would a creator produce human beings with genomes that are littered with junk? Yet in the last decade, there have been discovery after discovery after discovery that indicates that junk DNA has function. And the floodgates burst open in the fall of 2011 when the phase 2 results for the ENCODE project were reported. This project was designed to identify functional elements in the human genome. And to everybody's surprise, when the results were tabulated, 80% of the human genome consists of functional DNA. It went from 5% to 80%. This was just phase 2 results, and the expectation is as phase 3 results come in, that remaining 20% will turn out to be functional as well. This is what Ewan Birney, who headed up the ENCODE project, said to Ed Young for Discover magazine. And what's in the remaining 20%? Possibly not junk either. According to Ewan Birney, it's likely that 80% will go to 100%. We now have a new view of the human genome. Instead of being a wasteland of garbage, it appears to be an elegantly designed system where that 95% of so-called junk DNA actually is playing a role in regulating gene expression, turning us from a genetic blueprint into a human being. Eric Green, who's the director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, said this: during the early debates about the Human Genome Project, researchers had predicted that only a few percent of the human genome sequence encoded proteins, the workhorses of the cell. The rest was junk. We now know that this conclusion was wrong. ENCODE has revealed that most of the human genome is involved in the complex molecular choreography required for converting genetic information into living cells and tissues. In the last 25 years, I've seen challenges to the biblical understanding of human origins from science turn into very powerful, credible reasons to think scientifically that the biblical account of human origins is true. We went from multi-regionalism to the concept of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. We went from this idea that human beings are only different in degree, not kind, from other creatures, to this view of human exceptionalism, where human beings uniquely possess symbolic capability that I think, again, aligns with the image of God. And we've gone from this view where the genome consists of junk DNA entirely to a genome that looks as if it is elegantly designed. The fingerprints of a creator are all over our genomes. Now, I know I went through this material pretty quickly this morning and at a superficial level. And if you want to dig deeper, I would commend my book to you, Who Was Adam, that again I co-authored with Hugh Ross. And I really would encourage you to think about how you could use this information to engage non-believers. Because again, the biblical account of human origins is critical ultimately to the gospel itself. Now, here's a point of confession. Sarah Sumner inspired me last night, so I'm going to tell the truth. At least on this issue. When it came to the junk DNA challenge, in my heart of hearts, I wasn't sure that we were ever going to be able to overcome that challenge. Now, one of the first articles I wrote when I started with Reasons to Believe about 17 years ago was an article on junk DNA. And I boldly made the prediction that we would discover function for junk DNA eventually. And I made that prediction because of my conviction of what I thought Scripture was teaching. But in my heart of hearts, I wasn't sure that that challenge would ever be overcome. And yet, I can remember the day when I picked up the journal article in Nature in September of 2011 and saw the ENCODE results being published. It was a thrill. This incredible challenge suddenly evaporated right before our eyes and became this incredible opportunity to demonstrate the credibility of the human origins account. And so the lesson is, even the greatest challenges can turn into opportunities for the gospel. And this is very much the case for the life of Blind Willie Johnson. As I said, Blind Willie Johnson spent most of his life in Marlin, Texas. But in 1940, he moved from Marlin, Texas to Beaumont, Texas. And again, he began to play on the street corners of Beaumont, Texas. And it had been 10 years at that point from the last time he recorded anything for Columbia House. After 1930, he no longer recorded anything for Columbia House. Nobody knows why. He just stopped recording. But he did remain faithful to sharing the gospel. And because he had some national notoriety, he was invited to sing in churches and at camp meetings and at revivals. But that's how he spent the remainder of his life, is serving the Lord in that way. In 1945, he died tragically. The house that he was living in Beaumont, Texas, burned to the ground, and he had no place else to go because he lived a life of poverty. So he returned to the burned-out shell of the house that he had. He made a makeshift bed, and he spent the night, and as a result of that, he contracted pneumonia. But because he was black and because he was blind, the hospital refused to admit him in Beaumont, Texas. And so he died in an undignified way as a marginalized human being. Can you imagine what was going through his mind in the last few days of his life as he was dying? He had committed his life to the gospel, and this is how it ended. But the remarkable thing is the legacy he's left behind is astounding. Because after his death, 20 years after his death, suddenly his influence was felt throughout popular music. In the 1960s, the British rock musicians became enamored with the British blues musicians of the 1920s and 30s. They viewed blues music as being exotic and fascinating, and so they began to play their guitars the way that the blues musicians played their guitars in the 1920s and 30s. They modeled their vocal work after the blues musicians, and it became commonplace for musicians to cover the songs of these black blues musicians. And among them, the most influential was Blind Willie Johnson. And in fact, a number of rock groups covered Blind Willie Johnson's songs. One of them was the group Led Zeppelin. How many of you know who Led Zeppelin is? How many of you don't want to admit Bet you know who Led Zeppelin is. Well, I was not a Christian in high school, and Led Zeppelin was one of my favorite groups. And I learned about Blind Willie Johnson by listening to Led Zeppelin albums. And it's interesting because if you know anything about Led Zeppelin, they were incredible musicians, but they probably were known more for their debauchery than they were for their music. They clearly were not on a mission to pronounce the gospel, but yet they were doing that by playing gospel songs that Blind Willie Johnson recorded. And I can remember as a high school student walking around my house singing along to Led Zeppelin in my dying time, "Jesus, I'm going to make you my dying bed." It's remarkable because the seeds of the gospel were being presented to me when I was not a Christian by a non-Christian rock group that was covering the gospel songs of Blind Willie Johnson. Suddenly his ministry spread from throughout the United States to throughout the world thanks to groups like Led Zeppelin and Eric Clapton. But the greatest legacy of Blind Willie Johnson centers around a song that he recorded called "Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground." This was adapted from a Methodist hymn written in the 1700s. And Blind Willie Johnson's genius was that he moaned the lyrics as opposed to singing the lyrics. And in fact, it's an incredible piece of Americana. Musicologist and musician Ry Cooder says it's the most transcendent piece in all American music. A copy of this recording is on board the Voyager 1 spacecraft. Voyager 1 was launched in 1977, and the mission was designed so that the spacecraft would eventually leave our solar system. And in fact, a couple of years ago it has. It's now in interstellar space. It's traveled about 13 billion miles. It's traveled a vast distance. And when Carl Sagan and other people at NASA realized that this spacecraft was going to leave our solar system, they had this bright idea. Let's put a phonograph on board with a gold disc that has sounds of the earth. And so Carl Sagan, along with this committee, basically recorded greetings in different languages from people around the world. There's a greeting, interestingly enough, from Jimmy Carter, the President of the United States in 1977. And they put musical samples from different eras in Earth's history. And one of the songs that they chose was "Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground." Now, it's interesting that Carl Sagan would choose a gospel song to put on the spacecraft, given that Carl Sagan was like Richard Dawkins of his day, if you don't know who he was. He was an astronomer, he was a popularizer of science, and he used that platform to advance atheism to the American public. But it turns out that Carl Sagan didn't realize what he was doing when he chose "Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground." This is what Blind Willie Johnson scholar D.N. Blakey says. Alongside music by Beethoven, Bach, and Stravinsky were two other giants of Black American music, Louis Armstrong and Chuck Berry. Another piece was a night chant sung by Navajo Indians, and some say that "Dark Was the Night" was chosen partly because they mistakenly thought it was on the same subject as the night chant. That is, human isolation in a dark place. The song does indeed deal partly with that in its main theme of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Blind Willie Johnson's ministry started in the small town of Marlin, Texas. In his lifetime, it spread throughout the United States. After his lifetime, it spread throughout the world in the grand irony that rock bands were presenting the gospel through Blind Willie Johnson's gospel songs. And then finally, the gospel has been proclaimed throughout our solar system and now beyond because of Blind Willie Johnson. Blind Willie Johnson turned challenges into opportunities for the gospel. And the impact that his life had was beyond imagination. He just remained faithful to what God was calling him to do. And he left behind an incredible legacy for the sake of the gospel. I can't wait to get to heaven to meet Blind Willie Johnson and to shake his hand because he has had a profound influence on the way I approach ministry. And my question to you is, when you get to heaven, who's going to want to come up to you and shake your hand? because you were willing to turn challenges into opportunities for the gospel. Thank you.